Good morning. My name is Arnika, and I will be your conference operator today. At this time, I'd like to welcome everyone to the CA APM Community Webcast. All lines have been placed on mute to prevent any background noise. After the speaker's remarks, there will be a question-and-answer session. If you would like to ask a question during this time, simply press star, then the number 1 on your telephone keypad. If you would like to withdraw your question, press the pound key. Thank you. I will now like to turn the conference over to Keith Palmer. Please go ahead, sir.
Welcome, everyone. Good morning, and thank you for dialing into today's CA APM Global User Community Webcast. My name is Keith Palmer. I'm the Vice President of the APM Global User Community. I'm accompanied by CA's Community Programs Analyst, CJ Schumann. First, a couple of quick announcements. Our Community Webcast raffle, each randomly selected community member will be chosen to receive a $100 Amazon gift card. The winner will receive an email from caapmcommunity@gmail.com. Keep your eyes open for it and make sure to check it. Well, our next webcast will be on August 21st. That'll be another exciting APM Town Hall. If you haven't been to the community site lately, go and check out our new community platform. This webcast is being recorded and will be posted on the community archives. If you have any questions during the presentation, please ask in the QA panel in the WebEx, not in the chat window. The presentation will take about 60 minutes. We appreciate all the activity on the message boards. Thank you all for your participation. Before we get started, Director of Product Monitoring APM, Anand Akella, has a few words to share about blogging on the new community website. Anand, it's all yours.
Thanks, Keith. So Keith just talked about new community web page, which is very interactive. And one of the new features is the blogging functionality, which is available to all the community members. If you go to the community page and go to the right-hand side, you will see a list of blog posts. There are like 5 or 6 blog posts posted there. What I am here to do is encourage all of you to post blogs, share the best practices, the learning that you have. When you ask questions, if some of these questions get addressed, or you find a workaround, or you find a solution, talk about those, write about those, and share with your peers. And blog is the perfect place to do that. Mary has written a blog on how to get started, and if you have any questions about that, about how to create your first blog, post that in a discussion forum. And this is our community. This is the user community, and it will be great if the users could share their experience learning and best practices. That's all I had to say. Back to you, Keith.
Thanks, Anand. Great information. Thanks for sharing that. Today, our presenters are Cohen from CA, speaking on ADA to APM Field Tech Connector. And then we're going to have Rob Webb, also from CA, and he'll be presenting information on ADA setup best practices. Again, one quick reminder, if you have any questions, ask in the QA panel, and Corey and Rob will answer your questions at the end of the session. Corey, it's all yours.
Thanks very much. And just hopefully everyone can hear me. How do I guess?
I turned the ball over to you, Corey, so if you just go into your presentation on the top, you should be able to advance everything.
Here we go. Let's find it.
You're the one right in the middle.
Maybe it doesn't show up on mine. Let me make my window bigger. There we go. It was hidden. So, yeah, story for WebEx on a Mac. So, I'm Corey Cohen. I'm from CA Product Management, and I'm going to talk to you today about a connector that is available as a field pack. You can contact your pre-sales person, or I believe it's also one on our community site, to download this component, which will allow you to trend ADA data inside of your APM infrastructure, your enterprise manager. So I'm just going to kind of dig right into it because it's a lot of content. that I kind of want to get through, and I want to keep it short enough so I give Rob a lot of time to talk about some best practices with ADA. So some of the features is it takes the ADA trended 5-minute metrics and it essentially pulls them down into APM. If any of the ADA metric measurements are available for networks, servers, or applications. Excuse me. You can set alerts on the metrics because it's now in APM. If a metric doesn't have a specific value, it actually will also mark it as -1. So, for example, if a network has traffic and it shows traffic for a while and then suddenly that network disappears, no measurements for that network, it will show up as a -1. So you can actually set alerts on things that disappear or have no data. It does support multiple ADA consoles per APM Enterprise Manager. So a single installation of the connector can reach out to more than one ADA connector. Because of that, there has been some confusion in configuration for the field because we don't pre-configure certain things. So I want to make sure I go through things, and I will emphasize the steps that people usually forget so that you guys don't forget if you choose to implement this. There is a metric grouping option. It's not the same as an APM metric group, where you could create group of metric definitions so that you can say these are my gold metrics, my platinum metrics, or these are metrics for triage level 1 or triage level 2, so that you can manage which metrics you're pulling down for each resource. So the connector simply just brings the data and creates a trended metrics in APM. While the metrics appear to be 15-second, they're actually only pulled every 5 minutes on the clock. The reason why we actually data point them out at the 15 seconds is so that you can see crisp changes when you overlay them with 15-second metric data, for example, maybe from the app server or something else, instead of having kind of strangely drawn lines. You will also notice it actually shows up in the superdomain, and each ADA server, and whether it's application or network, will wind up in a separate quote-unquote application that can then be placed in an interscope domain. But ADA shows up in a special host here called ADA. Each ADA server shows up here, and then for each one, you get to show application, network, and then your servers, and then the metrics you choose underneath. It only supports APM 9.x or higher. It must run on a collector. It will not run on the MOM itself. It writes data to SmartStore, which means it should not reside on the MOM. Technically, MOMs are not supposed to write data to SmartStore other than their alert data by consensus. They must have port 80 access to the ADA servers being monitored. That is how they connect up through there and create a web service call to pull down data. And it needs ADA version 9 or higher. So to quickly go through how you install this, and I do mean quick, because this actually, a subset of this presentation is included with the deployment, so you could follow along when you go to deploy. You basically have a jar file that is dropped in the Enterprise Manager's plugin directory, and a bunch of web files that are placed in a directory you create called ADA under the Web Apps directory under EM, and you can protect these pages by enabling the security on the web server on the Enterprise Manager. Restart your server, and then you can actually go on your Enterprise Manager that it's installed on to a directory, whatever the web port is, ADA, and you get the management pages. Now, the management pages, you can view all of the metric collection groupings that are available, or you can go out and create new ones or add or remove specific metrics like disconnects or, response times, things like that from the groupings, which are then the groupings are assigned to individual resources or components. So the quick way that people do this is typically go in and they click Manage. Actually, let's make it a little easier. They click Open here. They get a list of top 1,000, and they can cut and paste that in, and I'll show you that in a minute. But to go through, we can customize those default groups. When we click in, we can create a new group. And the groups are what are used to say, for example, performance defaults. Any resource I say give me performance default for networks or for servers or for a specific type, that's what will show up. Simply adding an ADA server, which I'll show you in a minute where that's done, doesn't tell it to bring over the data. It just says this is an ADA server you can talk to. Excuse me. So you choose which metrics are part of the grouping. You can uncheck or check them all. You update. And now you can go out and manage the ADA console. You can add a console. Once you've added the console, then you can go and you can choose to either monitor a top number, and that'll go to the monitor automatically top networks, top servers, and top applications, or you can click on here and manually go in and add them. The most common mistake is to just add it and walk away and not actually go in and add things to monitor inside. Once you actually go in and you edit and you choose, you can edit which metrics, like which metric groupings are going to be pulled down from this ADA server, and then which hosts apply to those metric groupings by clicking further. And I mentioned the top list already. The currently configured ADA consoles you can view them and choose which host. Very straightforward. Now here, I mentioned earlier in the beginning, you can actually get a list of all the resources available. You can cut and paste, put this in Excel, delete, add, and then paste that list in as well when you're editing. I know I'm jumping back and forth here, but when you click here, you can get that list. And if we go in again and we edit the metric grouping, we have a place to paste the ones we want to add that are, manually. Now understand, you can also create comments because by putting a pound symbol afterwards, as well as if a host is named or renamed in ADA, that's actually what it'll be known as. So you see IP addresses here, but if I went in and explicitly named that host, that's actually what would show up, not the IP address. So you can also reset all the connections to have it to not wait. Normally it takes about a minute and it'll read the configuration, but if you don't want to wait the minute, you click this button, it resets all the connections to all the servers and reads the files, and it's kind of a hard reset on the integration. And then you can check that your metrics appear. And that's pretty much it. Oh, that's kind of funny. I just noticed that says pre-sales. I guess I cut and pasted that from someone's template. I'm actually from product management, so ignore that part. But anyway, I guess, are we opening it up for questions at this point, or are we waiting to the end? I know I kind of jumped through quick, but I wanted to make sure people just saw it. But this presentation, or a subset of this presentation, is actually part of the deployment, so you can follow along and configure it.
We can open up the call for questions if you like.
Great. And wow, I can't believe I haven't been in pre-sales in about 4 years. Yeah, everyone makes a typo.
At this time, in order to ask a question, press star, then the number 1 on your telephone keypad. Press star, then the number 1 on your telephone keypad. We'll pause for just a moment to compile the Q&A roster. At this time, there are no questions.
Great. So I guess, who do I make presenter now?
I'm switching it over for you right now. Okay, Rob, you should have control.
I do, thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Rob Webb. I've recently moved from an enablement position over to pre-sales. So I'm actually in pre-sales. So I think my title here is right.
That's
I'm going to be.
I stole your format because mine wasn't the right color format. So that's probably what happened. Now I'll let you continue.
Yeah, no problem. So what I'm going to be sharing with you today is really some best practices that I go through whenever I set up ADA. And it's not the basic setup, assuming that's already been done. I come in and it's just a matter of let's make sure you got the best data, you're not missing some data, that everything's defined at least to some extent so that we can start using the data as quickly as possible and getting the best results possible in ADA. So let's see. So we're going to talk a little bit about packet collection and defining the networks, the servers, and the applications. And I'm going to be going through this fairly quickly, and we should have plenty of time, though. So packet collection is really about location. You've heard location, location, location. When it comes to business, well, packet collection is the same way. You want to be collecting the data from the right locations. You have to keep an eye on duplication and understand how we deal with that and how we don't deal with that. To talk a little bit about data that's lost in collection. If your collection architecture is set up such that you're not collecting everything and what that does and how egregious that could be to your environment. And also monitoring your collection process just so that you know if you're losing data in collection. So we're going to start with location, right? Ideally, you want your collectors, your taps, your spans, whatever, as close to the servers as possible. And there's really two reasons for that. One is you want the most accurate demarcation that you can get when you have a network problem versus a server problem or an application problem. ADA does a real good job of defining that fault domain for you. Okay, it's a network, or no, it's not the network, it's in the data center. What's really happening is wherever that collection point is, we're looking at the data collected there, and we say, okay, on one side is the network, on the other side is the server. If you've got a lot of infrastructure between your collection point and your server, then anything that happens in that infrastructure will look like a server problem. So you want to minimize the amount of infrastructure between your collection point and your server. The other thing that it does by keeping the collection point as close to the server as possible is it also ensures that you get your server-to-server traffic. If you move it away from the server, let's say you're collecting at your core or your distribution layer, you're not going to see server-to-server traffic on the same switch unless you're collecting on the same switch that the servers are on. That's why it's the other reason it's important, because with ADA, you can do multi-tier analysis, which helps you even further pinpoint that fault domain so that you know that the problem is back at the database that's affecting your users at the front end, right? You can see that very quickly in ADA, but only if you're collecting against all the different tiers, all the different servers within that application. So those two reasons make it important. ADA will work if you're a little bit further out, but it works best if you're local to the server for your collection. All right, so from a duplication standpoint, a lot of times span setups on a switch where you're collecting your traffic from create duplicate traffic. That's because you end up with a copy of a packet as the data enters the switch, you get a copy. As the data leaves the switch, you get a second copy of it. So you end up with this duplication issue. right? Duplication will affect metrics. And the metrics it affects depends on the amount of duplication and all that. If you're using a multi-port collector and feeding it into a TIM, duplication is really bad because it really affects the CEM component a lot more than it does the ADA component. The reason for that is ADA does averaging. It will affect some metrics, but not as bad. It's a little bit more tolerant of a few things. The good news is the multi-port will deduplicate that traffic for you, assuming that the traffic comes in close together, right? So if it's coming in on the same logical port on a multi-port, the multi-port will deduplicate that because it recognizes, basically what it does is it takes a hash of the packets and it starts at the IP address in the IP header and looks further into the packet than that. So if the data and the IP addresses are the same, the TCP headers are the same, and the data is the same, then it says, okay, that's a duplicate. It ignores things like your TTL counter, which gets so that if it goes through a router and it changes and those packets still show up real close together, multi-port still says, okay, that's a duplicate. So I can throw away one of those. But those packets have to arrive within 8 packets of each other. If there's more than 7 packets in between them, it stops counting. It stops looking for the duplicate. Same with timing. If the packets arrive more than 20 milliseconds apart, then you end up with the duplicates will show up anyway, and it'll start looking like retransmissions. So what ends up happening is, when server A and server B are talking to each other, as server A's data enters the switch, a copy gets sent to your collection point, right, through your span. As that same packet leaves the switch, the second copy gets sent, right, and that's where you get your duplication. As long as those two show up right next to each other, the multi-port collector can dedupe that for you. But if there's a spread on it, because maybe you're collecting against 2 switches from 2 different locations, then your risk of having more packets in between those 2 is greater, and therefore your chances of deduping it is less. Right? Multi-port does a nice job of, if you look in the system status, you can actually see the discarded duplicate count, so you can see if it's deduping traffic. Right? It doesn't tell you if it's missing any. You really don't know that, but you know that you are getting duplicates when you see this, and you know that you're able to deduplicate at least a substantial number of them. In ADA, if you suspect you have duplication going on, the best place to look is in your packet loss percentage. If your packet loss percentage is, say, 10% or higher, 20% definitely. If you're seeing 20% or more packet loss percentage for a given network or given server, guess what? That's non-functional, right? If it's in production and it's working and people, and you still have a job, there's a good chance that you're not really losing that much traffic. You've probably got duplicates that are getting counted that are getting through your collector, right? Maybe you don't have deduplication if you don't have a multi-port. If you do have a multi-port, maybe it's not deduping it because they're too far apart, because your collection architecture is set up different. ADA has an INI file that you can activate, and it's in the admin guide for the details on it, but there's a retrans packet depths INI file. And here's an example where I did a side-by-side comparison. Customer showed me this after I helped them go through and activate that INI file. On the left, we see what they were seeing for packet loss percentage before we worked on it. On the right, when we activated that INI file, you see the reduction to where now you're seeing less than 1% loss. Right? So it cleaned up that duplication a whole lot. It doesn't remove it from your packet collection. It doesn't remove the overhead from the network collection infrastructure. But it does remove the duplication of the metrics within ADA itself. So ideally, you want to remove the duplicates as close to the source as possible, right? You don't send duplicates at all, or if you do, you remove them at the multi-port. But here, I'm showing you if the multi-port's not taking care of it or you don't have a multi-port, here's another way of doing it. Then we'll go to loss in collection. What happens if you lose your data in collection? Well, if you're dropping data in collection, right, what ends up happening is that it's not the same as losing it in production. If packets get lost in production, they get retransmitted. And we want to track that because that affects performance, right? If you're losing it in collection, it's not getting retransmitted. Therefore, it's just gone. ADA deals with that fairly well because at the TCP level, we don't have to acknowledge every single packet, right? If you're feeding it into, if you have the TIM running and CEM running for your APM component of it, then that data loss in collection becomes a real issue because it doesn't get retransmitted. Therefore, you're not able to reassemble application layer. You can't reassemble your HTTP traffic because you've got missing components of that traffic that's lost in collection. That's generally due to an oversubscribed span port. You're feeding too much data out of that switch. You're collecting too much data in the switch itself and trying to feed that down the pipe to your multi-port or whatever collector you have. If that loss is large enough, it'll start to impact ADA's performance metrics. But generally speaking, if it's small scale, if you're losing a couple of percentage points, not a big deal for ADA itself. It is a big deal for CEM. One of the things I recommend is monitoring your span ports, right? Wherever you're spanning to any device, not just ADA, but any device. If you're spanning data, those ports that are your actual span ports that are just used for monitoring should be monitored via SNMP, right? Whether you're using, eHealth, NetVoyant, IM, open source, freeware, third-party product, whatever, right? Whatever you're using for SNMP monitoring, make sure you're looking for outbound discards on your span ports. If you're getting outbound discards, it means you're oversubscribing that port. That brings us to our networks. Networks, I recommend using a roll-up for networks. We call it a catch-all sometimes, or all other networks. And also, I add two network types whenever I'm setting up networks. Right, so I'll set up, I'll create a network type for wireless networks, and I'll create a network type for internet. Right, so the roll-ups are basically, I'm going to roll up to make sure I'm accounting for all traffic. ADA will automatically use the best match as far as how it assigns traffic to a given network. If you've got a network defined as a /24, and it also matches a /16, it's going to show up in the /24 only. It gets removed from the roll-ups. So as long as everything's defined properly, you'll never use these roll-ups. And you really don't want to see the roll-ups, right? You should have very little traffic in your roll-ups, generally speaking. But what happens is, in case you haven't defined something properly, or you've missed something, forgotten something, the roll-ups ensure that you're still tracking all the traffic. Especially that's this first one, 0000/0, right? If you're not using a roll-up for all other traffic, then I've been to customer sites where they haven't put that in. They thought they had all their networks covered, but once we added that, we started seeing a whole lot of traffic they weren't accounting for affecting those applications, right? And there's a lot of metrics that you're not accounting for as well. So it's important to make sure that you're using the roll-up. And as a default, I always just add in this private address spaces as roll-ups, just so that I have them covered. And then what I'll also do is I'll do a roll-up for the customer network, in case you're not using a 10 dot or something, and you've got 137.15 or whatever it is, right? As a Class B network, then I would put in a 137.15.0.0/16 as a roll-up also, even though I'm defining all of the networks down to a /24 generally. I still want the roll-ups in there in case I forgot one or missed one or something. I'll still catch that traffic and it doesn't get ignored, because with ADA you have to tell it what to look for. This covers it from the network side. Network types, like I mentioned, I create a wireless network type and an internet network type. The reason I do that is because you have less control over the fluctuation within the network performance. Generally speaking, if you look at your ADA operations page, a lot of times if you haven't gone through this process, the networks that show up at the top of the list consistently are your internet-facing networks and your wireless networks. Why? Because you have the least control over providing consistent delivery, right? Because wireless, you have a lot of fluctuation with the wireless itself, and internet, you have no control over performance across the internet, whether it be distance, packet loss, whatever. So what I recommend to customers is create network types for those two, and then any of your networks that fit into one of those two categories, make sure it gets assigned to that network type. Then you can actually go into your applications and adjust your network metric thresholds, right, for your network round trip time, your retransmission delay, your network connection time, and your effective round trip times. You can go in and edit the sensitivity levels for those. And what I recommend is desensitize your internet and your wireless networks. You can actually cut those sensitivity levels in half, and thereby reducing the effect that they have, or their risk of showing up. So here I'm showing where you can go in and actually create a network type for, in this case, wireless. Then you can go into your policies, your performance thresholds, and the network metrics here. I've just cut these thresholds in half. Therefore, they are less, the number's less, so they're less sensitive, so that when the fluctuation happens within these type of networks, they're not going to change into your minor, major alarms as quickly, your incidents, nearly as quickly. They're going to have to be more of an impact before they actually trigger those, right? I don't turn them off. You could, but I don't turn that off. I still want it. I just make it less sensitive, so they're less likely to show up. They have to change more than a typical network would. That brings me to the servers. So server subnets should match your span. This is very important because when you're setting up your servers, one of the things you can do is you can set up server subnets, which was a great thing that we came up with a number of years ago to allow functionality based off of server IP definitions. Meaning if you've got a subnet that's dedicated to Exchange, for example, right? If your 10.10.10.0/24 is Exchange, it's always Exchange. It's never going to be anything but Exchange. You can actually create a server subnet for that. And then when you create your application for Exchange, you assign that server subnet to it. What that does is now when your administrators go to stand up a new server, as long as it's in that subnet, it automatically gets added into that Exchange application, which is great. Now, a lot of our customers don't have that level of standardization for their IP subnetting, right? That's fine too. It just means you're still doing things manually, right? They add a new server, you got to add it in manually into ADA. But the server subnet still comes in handy because you can say, okay, well, I've got a block of servers that I want to monitor, right? And they're all inside the data center and everything's inside the span. So I'm going to go in and I'm going to create a server subnet for 10.100.0.0/16 because that's going to cover all my servers. Well, guess what? If that also covers servers in another location, then what ends up happening is you're telling ADA that these servers are local to me. This is the group of servers that I'm spanning, is really what you're saying with your server subnet. If you're including servers that are remote in that, it's looking for anything in that subnet or subnets that responds to a SYNAC, or with a SYNAC, I should say. Because whenever it sees a SYNAC, that's the server side of the three-way handshake. And that's the key that we're looking for to say, hey, that server is listening and responding to an application request. It's listening on that port. Therefore, we should be tracking that because you've said it's in that server subnet, and we see the SYNAC. So therefore, we're going to add it into our auto-discovered applications. If your server subnet's including stuff that's remote from you, if any of your servers connects as a client out to a remote site and does a SYN, and that server responds out the remote site with a SYNAC or the remote data center or whatever, so responds with a SYNAC, we're going to add it and map it and assume that it's local because that's what the server subnet is telling ADA. These are local to me. These are inside my span. So it's important that you don't include address space in that server subnet that is outside the span. Application definitions. Now it looks like my font got shifted a little bit, but that's fine. Defining applications. So really what ADA is doing, what it calls an application is really a service that's running on a server. right? It's a listening service on a server. You got an IP address and a port number. And when you combine those two together, we call that an application. Right? We also give you the ability to combine multiple IP addresses on that port number and call it all the same application, right? Which works really nice because then you can do things like comparison. So if you have a cluster of servers, that is your business objects web tier, right? And you've got 5 servers in there. I'd include the IP addresses for all 5 servers against that and port 80, and therefore it shows up as one application, business objects tier 1 web on port 80. And if I click on my server link inside one of the views, it'll actually give me a breakdown of the performance for all of those servers. So I can actually do a very quick comparison so that I can check my load balancing, right? Are my total sessions the same? Do I have one server that's refusing more sessions than another? Do I have one server or servers that are slower performance compared to the others, right? Those things show up very, very easily when you define it that way. So the naming convention that I recommend using is, and I selected the application name business objects, right? So I would do the application name followed by the tier, and a tier gets used as a different term for some customers, right? You can think of it as a test point or even a TCP termination point, right? If you have a load balancer that's sitting in front of your web servers, my T1 would be load balancer, or LB for the function, right? And I'd still do port 80 and port 443. Notice here in this example, I'm showing business objects as the application name all the way through. Tier 1, I've got twice. I've got a Tier 1 web, and then I include the port number as part of my application name, and this is exactly why. Because some applications will run the same port number, or the same tier number, with different port numbers. In this case, I've got users that may access this application over port 80, and then I've got other users or other functions within the web server that are going to be secure and access over 443. They're both tier 1, meaning this is where the users terminate their TCP session, is at my web tier. The web tier is dependent upon the app tier. It reaches back to the app tier. Therefore, that becomes T2. The app tier is dependent upon the database. It becomes T3. So you end up with this multi-tier application, and assuming that I'm local to these servers so that I'm seeing all the traffic not only from the users to the web servers, but also between the web and the app and the database. If I'm collecting all that data, then I can very quickly look and see where is my bottleneck, where is my response time problem coming in, right? If I've got something happening in the back end that's slowing down, it's going to show up in my web tier as slow server response time if it's something bad enough to impact my users. So if I see a spike in business objects T1 web, whether it be 80 or 443, either one, I see a spike in server response time there, I'm going to look at my back end. I know my problem then is inside my data center. And I'm going to look into my back end, meaning I'm going to take a look at my Tier 2 app and my Tier 3 database and see if I've got issues there. Wherever I see, let's say I look at Tier 1 web, I see high server response time. So I go to Tier 2 app and I see high server response time. I look at Tier 3 database, I don't see the high server response time. Therefore, I know that whatever's happening is impacting my Tier 2 app delivery, right? And it's not a high server response time from the database. It could still be a delivery mechanism from the database to the app server, but my fault domain, my troubleshooting point then becomes from my Tier 2 app, because that's where I see high server response time, back. And it only has to go back one tier, because if it was any further behind that, if I did have multiple tiers behind that, if it was any further behind that, it would still show up on the next tier, right? So my fault domain very quickly becomes between Tier 2 and Tier 3. Something happening there is impacting my ability to deliver data out to Tier 1. It is a very quick way of troubleshooting, especially when you have a good, consistent naming convention that allows you to focus on this. You can get into more advanced things by doing that also, like setting up performance center grouping around your tiers and then able to troubleshoot based off of basically a single page where you can scroll down and figure out where your fault domain begins and who needs to be working on the problem. They can quickly identify that the problem is within the app tier, so they know it's in the data center. They know it's between the app and the database. The network team doesn't need to stay on troubleshooting that. They get the right people looking at the right problem very quickly and saving themselves a whole lot of time and frustration when it comes to troubleshooting issues. And that's pretty much what I have for you today. So do we have any questions?
At this time, I'd like to remind everyone, in order to ask a question, press star, then the number 1 on your telephone keypad. That's star, then the number 1 on your telephone keypad. We'll pause for just a moment to compile the Q&A roster. At this time, there are no questions. At this time, there are no questions.
I think that'll conclude our webcast for today. Anand, Corey, and Rod, thank you very much for presenting.
Certainly.
Certainly.
Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes today's conference call. You may now disconnect.